Now we're going to turn our attention to some specific passages of Mark, some of the hard parts that we've wrestled with as individuals, stories about Jesus that don't seem to fit with what we want or what we like Jesus to be, or at least kind of the received ideas we have of him. And so we're going to work through chronologically now to kind of see how these stories build on each other. All right, so to get started, we're going to look at one that Jason's brought to our attention. Jason, you want to orient us to that?
Yeah, so in Mark 4, in the beginning of Mark 4, Jesus tells kind of the first maybe extended parable in Mark, where he talks about the sower sowing seed on different kinds of places in the path. And then in 4:10, we read, when he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that, and then here quoting, I think, Isaiah, they may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. So like a basic reading to me, what I hear Jesus saying is, the reason I speak in parables is because you are the special people, and I want you to have the secret. But all those people, I actually am intentionally obscuring the truth from them so that they will not turn their hearts and be forgiven. I don't know what to do with that. And I think it's interesting, from what I understand, like the other gospel writers, they try to soften that, but Mark just puts it out there. And that's really hard for me to hear from Jesus.
Yeah. What do the rest of you think? Me? How did you encounter this maybe when you were in like Sunday school or with your with other teachers? Have you heard explanations that have worked for you, or is it kind of always just glossed over?
Well, in chapter 4, it says in verse 9, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And that's something that's also repeated later on throughout Mark. That's kind of almost a redeeming factor for me, where he keeps saying, whoever has ears, like, give him the opportunity to hear. So even though we only have the opportunity to hear these parables and we can never actually experience Jesus in person, there's still this opportunity that as long as we have the ability to hear and we choose to, there's still that redeeming opportunity.
Okay, so we see a tension in the text between Jesus saying, I'm purposely keeping this from people, but you know, like, people could still like put their brains to this and try to figure it out and engage and hear if they really wanted to. And so maybe there's a little bit of an amelioration there. Okay, good. Any other thoughts?
It makes you wrestle with the tension of like, who is this text for, in some sense. So like if it's written in kind of like a commonplace like Greek, it's like it's not necessarily like whereas like Matthew is definitely written for like a Jewish audience. Like, who is this audience? Like, who is the outside group? Who is the inside group? Who is he trying to obscure it from, and who is he not? So I think like I have to ask those questions, because I don't necessarily know right off the top of my head, like why, like for who is he wanting that to be heard?
Yeah. So that's actually
I'm sorry, isn't there even just the idea though that like doesn't this sound Gnostic to you in a really uncomfortable way? To you has been given the secret. I don't want Gnostic Jesus. I like generous Jesus, you know, the guy whose entire movement is about sort of, you know, including the excluded and like blowing open the doors and inviting everyone. I just don't like that he says the reason I do this is so that they may not turn and be forgiven. That's just like,
yeah, no, I'm not removing the tension and saying what I'm saying there. Like it's more so that like I again don't understand who or why, like who is he wanting to kind of overhear that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yep, totally tracking. Yeah.
So I think there's a couple things to think about. One is this tension that we've already established in the gospel narrative structure itself, right? That this particular gospel is really concerned with interrogating the reader. Who do you think he is, reader? Are you one of the ones whose heart is being hardened and who won't receive what Jesus has to say? Or are you one of the ones who gets to be with the 12, who wants to be a part of this and wants to see? So I think maybe that helps us, that maybe it's not that Jesus is trying to keep people out on purpose as like an overarching plan, but as part of this rhetorical positioning. Who do you think that I am? Which I think ties really nicely into what we saw going on with Messiah all the time, right? Like the constant, I think, problem so many of us had viewing that is that, like, who do I think this is, right? And what are the consequences of saying, I think this is actually Jesus, or I think this is actually God? that's really costly and really dangerous and like deeply disruptive if you're going to make that choice. And so maybe part of it is the rhetorical positioning of this particular gospel itself, which is why maybe the other gospels, they're not so interested in this interrogation of the reader through their form. So that's one possible idea. The other idea, though, is more with the big narrative structure, right? We want Jesus to just invite everybody in from the beginning. If everybody repents in chapter 4 and goes, wow, we've been wrong, let's return to God, well, does the cross happen? If everybody like actually believes him, then they don't end up on that road. He doesn't become the suffering servant. He doesn't atone for the sins of the world and undo death and sin and the power of brokenness. And we don't get the resurrection. So I wonder if part of this too is, as much as it really sucks that God's plans don't always let me be on the inside right when I want to be, sometimes God's plans, he has a longer game plan than what I'm privy to. And at chapter 4, it's not the time yet for everybody to be getting it. Because then,
well, and it's interesting too, like he's quoting from the Isaiah call narrative. And so like he's quoting from like this, like, oh, go out and like tell the people, but like kind of make it obscure. Like that's what God is telling Isaiah to do, like as a prophet. And so like kind of like tying into like the Pharaoh, like, oh, harden their heart so that like I can be glorified kind of thing. Like that's kind of what's happening here too. Like seeing that he's like intentionally pulling from Isaiah 6, in which he's like called to be a prophet who will make people not see and not hear and not know so that they can be punished by God, which again is a lot of like, that's not a fun thing to say in church, but that's what's being said.
Well, and it's really important to recognize that Mark is writing a sort of new Exodus narrative through his use of Isaiah, through his use of different parts of the Exodus structure. And yeah, I mean, we have to think about like, what is the end goal here? The end goal of the whole Jesus project is this deep, profound liberation and freedom, not just for anything, but so that we can be the people of God. Right? It's the same thing in the Exodus narrative. The whole point of what goes on with Pharaoh and the plagues is it's not just to accomplish a sort of mediocre freedom. And I can't help but think of like American race politics. It's not just to get like the Civil War and get slavery off the books in some sort of legal way so that we can have generations of systemic racism. The point is deep, full, totalizing freedom that frees us to love and worship God and to bring his shalom to the world. And that can only happen if God's glory is proven in a really deep way and demonstrated in a really deep way that maybe takes us through some difficult parts first. And so, I mean, God has to defeat the Egyptian gods. Not just have Pharaoh go, yeah, sure, 3 days in the wilderness, go for it, go worship and come on back, and we'll see if we can improve working conditions a bit. That's not a good end to the Exodus. And in the same way here, like Jesus has to defeat death for the story to be what it's going to be. So I that would be my answer, is like maybe part of this is that frustrating thing of not getting to be the star of the show. We talked about back with the Joseph narrative, right? That sometimes you've got to go through the really dark bits to get the right ending.
I mean, it's funny, like until just now, I hadn't thought of this as sort of possibly part of the same thing as the Messianic secret. But now I'm kind of hearing it more sort of along the same lines, right? That he's kind of keeping this thing tamped down a little bit until sort of it's known in its fullness, sort of after he's done what he's going to do for us, right? And also, Jenna, to what you were saying earlier, the more I think about it, the more I really relate that, like, whether or not there are crowds 2,000 years ago who are being excluded, we're the reader and we're being brought in. And I do kind of hear how it almost like raises the stakes. It's like, it's up to you. Like you're being brought in. Do you want to take advantage of it, right? Like there's a secret here, but you're being, yeah, that's really powerful.
Yeah. And I think this illustrates the importance of like treating the Gospels as narrative units. So often there's a tendency to like teach across the Gospels, like to pull out the theme, and we'll preach it from Mark and Matthew and Luke. And we lose the sort of narrative integrity, which actually can create a lot of problems, right? Because then you've got Jesus basically just keeping people out for no reason.
Right.
So I think as you guys know, that's been one of the kind of underlying arguments for the very existence of this class, is we have to learn to read like readers, like literary folks who are seeing these as units, as real stories. And so I think that's, this is a good argument for why we need to do that. Otherwise, Jesus just seems like a jerk.
He does.
Excellent. Anything else you want to say about this, or should we move on to the demon-possessed man in chapter 5? All right. Jillian, this one was yours, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you orient us to it a bit? Tell us why you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so this one was really intriguing. First of all, I didn't really remember it being told when I was a kid, which is interesting, especially since it seems like a good story that you could tell kids, where the demons cast off into pigs that then run off the cliff and die. So just kind of interesting the way that you have Jesus casting out the demons in this way, because it's whenever he's seen casting out the demons in the other ones, it's not like he's necessarily putting the demons into something else. That was interesting to me. But the biggest thing that stuck out to me about chapter 5 is the fact that Jesus encourages Legion to go and share what the Lord has done for him at the end of this chapter, where in every other chapter he's seen saying he strictly charged them that no one should know this, or don't tell anybody I'm here, and people would still end up sharing it. But again, going along with the theme of Jesus not wanting to be a celebrity, so why in this instance, why does he pick Legion, where everybody's at first scared when they hear about what he's done with Legion, but then he encourages Legion to go off and to tell everybody when everybody else is asked to be quiet?
Those are great questions. So we have Jesus really interacts with the demons here. It's maybe an important thing just to note, because we haven't said this yet. The demons get who Jesus is every single time in Mark, which is not maybe the best PR campaign. I mean, if like, I don't know, I don't really want like all the bad guys talking about who I don't know, there's a funny thing, and that Mark would include that, right? So maybe we want to come back to it. The demons always get who Jesus is, but Jesus really interacts with the demons here in a profound way. He sends them off into the pigs, which again, like, why not just cast them out? Just send them back to hell where they came from or whatever. And he commands the man to go and report it the first time this has happened. So this story feels like basically out of place with everything else that's happened in Mark up to this point on almost every single point. So that's really interesting.
I almost got the vibe with Jesus, like if you kind of follow his ministry track, you see a lot of him when he's telling people don't tell anybody, kind of in the earlier parts of his ministry, and it seems like when it starts to becoming closer to when, you know, things need to start happening and more people need to get involved and it's getting ready for his time to, you know, die, he's allowing people to go tell, almost as a way, you know, it's time that things need to start happening. And so that's kind of the vibe I got. I don't know if anybody kind of noticed that at all.
Interesting. Okay. That's actually a really interesting observation, Ellie. I want to come back to that. Jenna?
Yeah, I think the reason why he gives permission to this man to go and to talk about him and to kind of like proclaim the good news is because he's a truly liberated man. He's not just someone who's like been witnessing and watching and seeing spectacular things and then wants to go like gab about it. Like he's somebody who actually in some sense has like a testimony of like, oh, like I was suffering and now I am not. Like, and so I think that this is the first person who can like kind of speak to the severity of what Christ has come to do. Yeah, like he is no longer afflicted. Like that's the gospel in a lot of ways. And so I think that that's why this man is given permission to go and talk about it.
Okay. Yeah. The sort of freedom he's experienced is the closest thing we've seen to what God's really on about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe it's even in the way that he approaches Jesus, because everybody, I mean, even at the end of the 10 chapters, when they approach Jesus and they call him a good man, and Jesus says, nobody can be called good except for my Father. Just kind of interesting how the man approaches Jesus, and he immediately falls down on his knees and then says, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? So it's like he recognizes Jesus' true character, where maybe some people hear about him in more of that celebrity way, where there's been a lot of talk around town, so they go and seek him out. but it's interesting that he really humbles himself by falling on his knees.
Yeah. Can we just look at I want to look at the first 5 verses here, because there's some really interesting stuff, I think. Again, if we think about it as story, right? Think of this as like a setting, right? So I'm going to read this. They went across the lake to the region of Gerasenes. Sorry, I should have practiced that one ahead of time. They went across the lake to the region of Gerasenes. Then Jesus got out of the boat, and a man with an evil spirit came from the tombs to meet him. The man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. So this is one of the things that's interesting to me when I read this setup is like just where we're located, right? We've crossed the lake and we've ended up in this location of tombs, right? And the man comes out of the graveyard, which is actually quite important in terms of, like cleanliness and uncleanliness. But he's been associated with dead bodies, like to even walk down a road where like a body might have, accidentally been buried underneath it can make you impure by Jewish ritual law. So he's marked in this really deep way as being in this place of like deep, like ceremonial and ritual impurity, but also like you don't even need to know that, like he's living in a cemetery. And the people he's viewed to be so dangerous to himself and to others that he's been like chained in the cemetery. And he breaks the chains, he's too wild. This is where he lives night and day. He's cutting himself. It's like if we think about this as like, it's like a descent into hell, right? We've crossed the lake into a place that is marked on every single level as the most God-forsaken of spaces you can imagine. It's a space of death, it's a space of bondage, it's a space of like exclusion and being cast out. It's a space of darkness, night and day among the tombs and the hills. Even just leading with the word night, like that's what reigns in your mind, right? Day and night, you think of day first, night, you get this, the darkness of the place. And then there's pigs, which is also not okay, like in Jewish ceremonial law. These are like the most unclean of creatures. I want us to look at Isaiah 65 really quick. So this is right before, this is post-exilic and talking about like the return of the exiles. Verse 4, Isaiah 65:4, talking about the people who sit among the graves and spend their nights keeping secret vigil, who eat the flesh of pigs and whose pots hold the broth of impure meat, who say, keep away, don't come near me, for I am too sacred for you. And it's interesting to me that this, like the kind of the elusive nature of this setting of the people in kind of their absolute worst place in Isaiah, coming back from exile and being in this kind of this place of deep darkness. And that Mark picks up on all that imagery and kind of brings us to this, this setting that is so filled with darkness and with the absence of God. In like every single possible literary marker, it feels like he can throw at it to say that this is a place where God is not. And then the man comes running to Jesus and fell on his knees in front of him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, what do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me. And that strikes me as really important. Like that this man is expecting that Jesus, who he is, and where this man is located, psychologically, spiritually, physically, literarily, the only thing that can possibly happen with God entering that scenario is torture.
I think it's interesting to note that whenever Jesus encounters a demon, there's another reference to like a boy who's demon possessed, and you always can tell the demons are terrified of Jesus. And that's kind of like when we read the Bible, like we're terrified of like Satan and demons and stuff. And so kind of in these passages, you get to see that the demons are actually way more afraid of Jesus and our faith in Jesus than anything else.
Yeah, they are absolutely terrified of him and afraid of how he's going to hurt them. It's interesting. I mean, who's speaking here? Like, is it the man speaking, or is it the demon speaking for the man? He shouted at the top of his voice. I mean, it's interesting to me that there's like this sort of narrative illusion between the two, right? That you can't distinguish. Does the man feel like he is going to be tortured by the presence of God, or is it the demon speaking for the man? But either way, this man is expecting nothing good and is scared to death of what Jesus is going to do. And Jesus then come out of him, what is your name? My name is Legion, for we are many. And then we start to, like, maybe he's talking to like this group of demons that are inhabiting the man, right? And cast them into the pigs.
It's interesting that he kind of has mercy on the demons like, please send us into the pigs. He's like, all right, you can go to the pigs. Yeah. That's a strange little twist here. To the thought about this man being told to go public with his healing, I don't know that we can like make the case for this from the text, but I've been just thinking about how this man's affliction is really public, and his affliction makes him a threat to his neighbors. And I almost wonder if, for this man's dignity to be restored, he needs to be allowed to go public. Like if this man can't explain what happened, he continues to be suspect, I imagine. Like, and maybe he still isn't allowed to sort of re-enter his community. I don't know, maybe this is Jesus creating an exception to his secrecy, because if he insists on secrecy for this man, it might mean that this man can't be reintegrated into the community that he wants to be reintegrated with. It's not like it's in the text, but I just wonder about that as I read this.
I think that actually makes sense with where I was going with the demons, because he seems to show mercy even on the demons in this passage, which again is kind of weird, because you think about like, no, just destroy the demons. Like they don't get mercy. And yet there seems to be even this almost mercy for the demons that's then coupled with this break of the messianic secret for this man.
It's also interesting. Is this the longest healing story in Mark? I think it feels like it in my last reading, it's just an interesting sort of where form meets content. It's just interesting that the most expanded story of healing is also the one where the man's then told to go proclaim the healing to everyone.
Yeah, it's definitely I think the longest uninterrupted one. The only one that might is the boy possessed by the evil spirit is almost as long. It would be pretty close as well, in chapter 9. Interestingly enough, Jesus doesn't interact with those demons. It's a very different sort of healing. But yeah, this is definitely one of the longest healings. Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you.
And like, unlike Bartimaeus, Jesus refuses to allow him to come along with him.
Yeah.
Which I also find kind of interesting. He begs to be a part of, to like join Jesus on the way, and Jesus refused.
Yeah.
I also think that the identity of the demon-possessed man, it kind of like raises or I guess points out like the theme of like how political this text is, and the fact that like Jesus is like deliberately seeking out like the most outside person he can possibly like seek out. Like this is someone who like is again like in a tomb. He's definitely not like an Israelite. Like he's cast out from society, like all of those things. And so again, like you can make like the very like devotional pastoral switch of like, oh, Jesus thought of this man, Jesus can seek you out. And like that's a kitschy way of putting it, but I also think like it's a really beautiful thing too, that like this is, which is odd coming right after like the tension in chapter 4 of like, oh, does Jesus want some people on the outside and some people on the inside? Like, well, I don't know, because he goes and he seeks out this man immediately after that.
Yeah, that's good.
And doesn't let him follow him.
Yeah.
But lets him feel the messianic secret.
Yeah.
So how do we make that not kitschy? Because I think Jenna, you're right, that the easy thing to do then is to turn that into the kitschy, like, Jesus can seek you out too, no matter how far you've fallen. And as you know, we've kind of pushed against those sort of like really kind of cheap turns in terms of how we engage the text in this course time and again. So if we all have our, you know, kind of, I don't know, what I would say is a healthy level of suspicion of those sorts of twists, what do we do with it then? Where is the maybe even deeper or more disturbingly redemptive sort of grace that we would say is going on in this passage? Or is it just that we've lost the literary imagination to appreciate just how deeply disturbing it really is in the first place?
I think the latter. I think that we get so used to stories that we forget to like talk about like how like detailed or odd or like weird, like how weird this would actually be if you witness this thing happening in front of you. So I think we lose something of that when we just kind of like skim or like gloss over like Sunday school-esque stories.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think about, so I like preaching is my job, and I think about how easy it is to like, it's really easy and tempting to like, oh neat, I'm going to include people the way Jesus does, and I'm going to preach things, but then to never let it become an indictment on the actual people that I have black sheep, or that like without actually asking the hard questions about like in my community or my church, because we're human, there's probably going to be a person or a kind of person or a profile or a life experience that we are most likely to actually sort of maybe subtly. So like, yeah, I feel like it's cheap to be like, oh, Jesus can, you know, reach you too. And it's hard to say, wait, what does this indict in our own sort of leadership or communities or whatever? I think it gets a little more real for me when I go that direction too.
I think the other thing that for me is really important is that he doesn't let the man follow him, because it comes back to that, like, what sort of job do you want in the story? And so often, I think especially in evangelical tradition, especially as it's been kind of experienced in the United States, it kind of intersects with this rugged individualism that always puts me as the star of the story. And I mean, if we think about even the way that evangelical tradition talks about like the conversion narrative, God is kind of the butler off stage to my journey of sin and redemption, right? Who comes in at the moment and helps me, but I am definitely the star. And we talked about this around the Joseph narrative and kind of the desire that we all want to be the star. We all want to be the chosen son. We all want to kind of have that, to think that our life matters, not just that our life matters, but that our life matters in the way we want it to matter. And I oftentimes laugh because, you know, George Fox, it's a great school. Everyone should come to George Fox. But I do like to laugh at the promise of exceptional life outcomes, because I hear that and I think, now, what sort of exceptional are we talking about? We're talking like biblically exceptional that involves a whole lot of like death, suffering, the cross, dying alone and cold in prison sort of stuff? Or are we talking like, you know, upper middle class career, nice stock portfolio, happy family? Like, what is an exceptional life outcome, right? So often I think we get caught up in wanting the story to be our story, where we get to be the person that does the awesome stuff, right? This man really wants to follow Jesus and like join the crowd and be part of the core team where he sees exciting stuff happening. And Jesus is like, no, you've got this other job you've got to do.
Well,
you've got to go tell your people about me.
To relate it back to Messiah, that's exactly what Felix does. He thinks that Almasi's come for him, but he really hasn't. And in turn, that's why he's going and neglecting everybody in Dilley, Texas, that needs his help. He has the only building left standing in the entire town, and instead he goes off and follows this man because he thinks that he's been called and it's his story to tell.
Excellent. Yeah. And he's so upset when Rebecca tells him, Daddy didn't come for you.
Yeah.
You have a different role in the play, Dad. And it's not the top name on the billboard.
Yeah. Like, it probably would have been better for Felix to like heed what Jesus is saying in like chapter 5, like, no, go to your people and like tell them about me, like there, like go to that land, don't follow me.
Yeah. And that can be really hard, right? Because how do you just like, okay, if you don't have Jesus actually standing there in front of you telling you go back, how do you figure out like what the right direction is? So I don't want to minimize the difficulty in discerning where God might be leading us as individuals, but it does seem to me that this pushes against the idea that you get to kind of just choose to follow Jesus on your own terms or the way that you want to. But that doesn't mean that your life doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that God won't descend into the deepest pits of hell for you, and it doesn't mean that you don't have a really important role. It just might not be the one you want.
Mm-hmm.
Is it over-interpreting to kind of pull out that when Jesus, the demons that Jesus is going to exorcise are named for like a Roman regiment of soldiers? I mean, should we push into that? I'm actually not very well schooled on like what people do with that, but it seems like we should go there, right?
I think so. Yeah. So do you want to say a little bit more about that? Why that seems important to you?
I don't know. I mean, we began all this by pointing out that good news is very political, right? That it's a sort of appropriation of Caesar's imperial cult and the way that Caesar spoke. So the beginning of the gospel, the beginning of an alternative or subversive sort of picture of power and kingdom in the world. And then here Jesus is casting out, the name Legion just doesn't seem like that's going to be neutral for its original audience. But yeah, I mean, that's just kind of where I'm starting at. It seems like if nothing else, it would be a little bit offensive to, if I'm a Roman, how about that? If I'm a Roman and I'm hearing this story, might be like kind of troubled by that, right?
I think it's another Markan allusion to the Exodus in some sense of like, oh, like Pharaoh's like chariots being like thrown into the sea, just as like the pigs, which represent Legion now representing like the Roman military, like being thrown into the sea in some sense.
Nice.
And God allows that and like the Red Sea to engulf like Pharaoh's chariots, and also allows the pigs to then go into the sea. And so it's kind of like this mercy of like they're dying in that way.
Yeah. Wow.
It's also a fabulously ironic overturning of messianic expectations, right? Because what we want is Jesus to come and throw literal Roman legions out of Israel and reestablish the Davidic throne. And so here he is throwing out a legion into the sea, a new Exodus, except it's
yeah, that's fascinating. Huh.
not the one we wanted. So yeah, I think Mark is playing with a whole lot of stuff here in terms. I mean, it's such a deeply elusive passage, like elusive than a, right? Yeah. Anything else we want to say on that? Does that answer that for you, Jason, or help give you some new paths to?
No, that's like, yeah, it's excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah.
So now we're going to move on to, let's see, our next one, was it the Syrophoenician's daughter?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So this is in chapter 7, starting verse 24. Jenna, do you want to orient us to that one?
Yeah. Okay. So the beginning of chapter 7 is like Jesus like speaking with the Pharisees, being questioned in that way, and then it has one of like the Markan ticks of like, and then immediately Jesus left that place and went to Tyre. He's still trying to like uphold like the secret. But a woman comes and she has a little daughter who is also possessed by a demon or an evil spirit. And she like seeks him out. And then Christ says, first let the children, in the NIV, first let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. So calling this woman a dog, or at least her people, the Syrophoenician people, a dog. And then she corrects him. She says, yes, Lord, she replied, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. So weird that he is able to like exorcise a demon without even being in the presence of the person who has the demon. So that's really interesting. But also, like this is the only person in the Gospels who ever like corrects Jesus, and Jesus receives it positively. And so she's kind of like butting up against him. And you see this happening with like conversations with like Pharisees or different like leaders and stuff, of like this argument happening. And Jesus tends to have those like hard edges. But in this time, she kind of gets it and like gets underneath like what he's saying, and she's right, which is really interesting. And it kind of plays with like, oh, how do we respond to like prejudices in some sense of like, this is a person who is very much an outsider. She's a woman. She has a daughter who is demon possessed. Like she's not doing too well when it comes to like her social currency, but she's able to kind of like talk to God in this very like sassy and witty way, and it's received well. So I like that.
I love it too. And I just want to, so this is not the first time in the biblical text we have seen God receive sassy well. Where else have we seen it?
a lot of places. I mean, like there's times when like Moses correcting God, different like prophets being like, maybe it shouldn't happen this way. Like Abraham with the like, are you sure you want to destroy Sodom? Like I think that there's lots of times when we see like people questioning God, and God is like, I don't know, he's not that petty, so he's able to like kind of take it and be like, all right, like I can respond to this well, and like thank you, like yes, like that's what this like kind of discourse should be. Or there's even a point, or I wish I remember what prophet it is, but where God responds to the prophet and says, okay, let's argue it out. Like, and that's like what it says. And so I love that. I think that's a good model for faith in some sense.
So, okay, so from the class, we have had 3 that we've talked about in detail. One is Abraham arguing with God over Sodom and basically taking God and saying, you're not going to destroy a whole city if there's righteous people in it. That's no, like, well, what if there's this many? What, and gets him to, if he can find 10 righteous people, God won't destroy the city, right? So Abraham argues with God and wins. Jacob wrestles with God and demands a blessing and wins and gets his name changed to Israel. And the other person we see in Torah that we focused on in this class is Moses arguing with God when God says, I am tired of this stiff-necked people. I'm going to destroy them all, Moses, and just start over with you. And Moses is like, no, you can't do that. Like, you're not that sort of God, and it would be really bad PR. What would the other gods and other people say if you bring your people out here and kill them? You can't do it, God. And God says, okay, fine, you're right. So it's interesting, Jenny, you're right. This is one of the only times, I think, and it's definitely the only time in the Gospel of Mark, where we see someone who is sassy with Jesus, where Jesus kind of seems to almost provoke her to be sassy, right? Like he is about as offensive as he can be, to create this sort of space where she can respond back. Let's just think about what characters Jesus has just created the space to align her with. Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. So narratively, Mark, in telling this story, has just, as you so well pointed out, like, this woman could not have less social currency than she has. She's a woman, she's a Syrophoenician. Does it say she's widowed as well? I don't think it does. She's a woman, she's a Syrophoenician, she's a foreigner. She has no claim to anything. She has no real social capital in this society. And she is the one who gets to play that prophetic role of the Abraham, Jacob, Moses, the prophet who argues with God and wins. I think that's super cool too. And let's face it, like, it's kind of the same thing that we see with God and Moses and God with Abraham. Like, it's almost like creating a space that they're supposed to step into and argue. If he hadn't called her people dogs, probably there wouldn't have been the space for it, right? So it's this funny sort of thing. I don't know. That's my take on the story.
What do you guys? I know I have an image in my mind of the expression on Jesus's face while he's doing this, and it's a bit of a knowing smirk, like the teacher who knows that their student is onto something, and they're pushing back just to actually strengthen the thing that's happening, like a helpful resistance. I think I used to read the story with Jesus saying it coldly. Now I read him saying the same things, almost kind of, again, like with that little like a wink, like, come on, you got it. I'm gonna push back, but you keep pushing on me. Like I love this story for that reason.
Yeah.
Well, and I think too that wink, I think that's there because that would be like an invitation for this woman to like speak against like this person. Like, I don't know many instances like in the ancient world in which a woman would feel comfortable to like speak against somebody who is like a rabbi, a teacher, or just blatantly just a man, to speak against someone and have people witness you do that. And so I think that wink, you have to assume that's there, and that's why she's able to kind of have this discourse.
Yeah. I think, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Other thoughts on this one? I think there are some readings that I've come across recently that argue that Jesus is learning here, that he's actually opposed to the Syrophoenicians and really takes them very genuinely. I have problems with those readings, but I do want to kind of like recognize that they are out there. Not because we see Jesus like growing and learning. I think that the Gospels themselves talk about Jesus growing in wisdom. So it's not like that I think when he was 3 years old, he was already like fully possessed of all of his godlike capabilities and knowledge. Like obviously he also was fully human. But it seems to me that the character of Jesus we see in Mark is coy and cagey and playful and like humorous with people in some different places. Like, and that the whole text is kind of inviting this sort of the reader into dialogue. And so that to take this on a sort of very prima facie, Jesus is actually like calling her a dog, is totally cold and straight-faced, and actually comes to some sort of moment of realization in himself that she's not a dog, she even belongs in, doesn't seem to work with the characterization of Jesus we get. It also comes after chapter 5. And we've already seen that Jesus seems to be pretty open to people in the most outcast of spaces. So it doesn't make sense that you have this realization here. So I kind of just wanted to like highlight that reading and explain why they're wrong. All right. So then the next one is, what was it? Did we have another one? Yes.
Yes, Mark 8, Jesus predicts his death, and I found this passage so interesting because, he talks about, I'm gonna die, and Peter's like, no, you're not. That's not gonna happen. And just, you really see how relatable Peter is. Like, if you were in this situation, I think a lot of us would react in a similar way if, our closest friend was like, I'm gonna die, and you're like, I'm not gonna let that happen. And we see Peter fight that numerous times throughout the Gospels. And Jesus's reaction is like kind of really funny, where he's like, get behind me, Satan, after, Peter's just like, I know you're the Messiah, and they have like this great moment, and then suddenly it kind of all goes away with the rebuking. And I just found that passage really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking at 8, starting around chapter 20, verse 27.
Yeah, kind of throughout that, and then the chunk on 31 through 33 when Jesus really is predicting his death.
Yeah, and so it's, I think, important, as we talked about previously, that this comes right after the blind man with the 2-part healing, right? Like the person who sees but doesn't quite get it. And then we get this story of Peter seeing and not really quite getting it. In light of what we were just saying about the Syrophoenician woman, and I've never thought about this possibility till this second, so this may go nowhere. How does Jesus actually say, when he rebukes Peter, get behind me, Satan? How do you hear? I mean, I've always heard it as like a get behind me, Satan, like this like moment of cold sort of like anger almost.
I tend to read Jesus as like sassy and sarcastic a lot, and I don't know if that's just because that's me inserting my own like personality like into Jesus, so maybe that's the Jesus that I want because that's how I am. But I think that that's a lot of like, when you do that, it makes some of the harsh statements of Jesus more like palatable in some ways.
Yeah,
I think especially in Mark, it fits the tone for him to be kind of like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun to think about Jesus playing around calling his friend Satan. There's just like a level of, I don't know, that's actually kind of delightful if he's playfully doing it. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Okay, look at verse 32. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. So that's an interesting detail, hey? So Peter takes Jesus aside. It's like, you've got to, again, imagine this like a movie, right? You've got the disciples and they're chatting, and Jesus has just told them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. What's going on with that? Like, Peter and Jesus come off. Peter starts to like, actually, no, like, that's not the way this is going to go down. Like, what are you talking about? Why does he turn back to the disciples to rebuke Peter? I have no idea. I just realized that he makes that turn. I'm wondering about that.
It kind of reminds me, and maybe this is an odd connection, of in The Office when they make like a look at the camera and then they say a thing, like they're kind of like, this isn't right? Like, because in the NRSV, like, but turning and looking at the disciples, so like the look, and then he rebukes Peter. So I think like kind of like that's like he's bringing them in like, no, like I'm kind of teasing this guy here.
I love that though, because what have we been saying all along about where the reader is situated? If the reader is situated with the disciples, right? That turn to the disciples and rebuking Peter is again another invitation to the reader. Like he's like, that's not right. Like, let's correct this.
Well, especially I don't know that there's you go.
I was just gonna say I
don't know. I was just gonna say I don't know that there's a lot of like readers that don't know like the end of the story in some sense, and so that nod and turn, like we're aware. And so we know that nod and turn at us, like what that means. And like, we're kind of in on the joke in some sense.
I was thinking of if a teacher maybe has a student come to them in private with a question, and the teacher realizes this is actually really instructive for the whole class. So I know you came to me over here, but I really want everybody to hear this because this is core, right? And like the fact that this confusion about Messiah and suffering, like the fact that it keeps happening, I wonder too if Jesus is like, I'm gonna need to pull this into our larger sort of instruction because you guys are all gonna have the same problem Peter's having. Maybe I'm gonna make an object lesson out of Peter.
Right. Yeah. No. Certainly, as a teacher, that rings very true. You realize, oh, what I just said there. Oops. Yeah. Let's try this again, and again, and a third time just to be sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that help some, Ellie? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so, and it's interesting, Jason, to follow up on that, like the bringing everyone else in, right? He rebukes Peter, get behind me, Satan, when he's looking at the disciples. Then the very next verse, then he called the crowd
to the crowd and the disciples. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of this building out, like let's be sure we all get this now. And I think, Jenny, you're right. Like nobody is ignorant of the end of the story who's reading the gospel. So yeah, we know what we're supposed to think. Yeah, excellent.
I find it funny just how Peter is kind of rebuked by Jesus multiple times for kind of making these very human-like accusations and mistakes, and he ends up being, the foundation of the church and building that, and how kind of throughout Jesus's life he kind of molds and shapes Peter into the man that he plans for Peter to be, in being one of those heads of the leading people to Christ and being an amazing, follower, and even dying, they all had very bad deaths, all the martyred people and all the disciples, but like, I feel like Peter's is personal to Jesus because he also was crucified and didn't feel worthy to be crucified the same way his Savior was, and hence why he was crucified upside down, which sounds way worse than being crucified right side up. But I don't know, I've never been crucified, so I can't say.
It feels like one of those bad like games you play in like 3rd and 4th grade. Would you rather?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. I have a passage I really want to look at, but I think it's going to be better in our next section. So we just had a really good deep dive into some of the problematic areas of this text. In our next session, what we're going to look at are some of the main characters. We're going to look at Jesus now as character and start thinking about like some questions like, who would you cast? Like imagine you're a movie director and you're making the Gospel of Mark. Who would you cast? What sort of things are you looking for? How would you frame these and film these? I also want to talk about Peter's character some more. And who are the other people who emerge as characters, and how maybe that helps us to locate some of the energy in this gospel, but also maybe open up our readings to be even like richer and fuller.